Hello, welcome everyone to our first event from the Theory from the Margins Consortium. We read recent theoretical interventions in the fields of decolonization and post-colonial theory and theory produced from and within the marginalized spaces in the global North and South. Our core team consists of researchers based in Oslo, Kristin Soraya Batmangelich, Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, Sindre Wangsta, and myself, Momita. Please find out more about us at theoryfromthemargins.com. We could not have asked for a better person, scholar, academic to inaugurate this collective's work than Professor Partha Chatterjee. Professor Chatterjee is a political theorist and historian. He studied at Presidency College in Calcutta and received his PhD from the University of Rochester. He divides his time between Columbia University, where Soraya has known him as a teacher, and the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, where I have known him as a teacher. He was the director of the Institute from 1997 to 2007. He's the author of more than 20 books, monographs, and edited volumes. And he is a founding member of the Subaltern Studies Collective. He was awarded the Fukuoka Asian Culture Prize for 2009 for outstanding achievements in the field of Asian studies. For those who don't know this about him, he's also a poet, a novelist, musician, playwright, and an actor. We are here today to discuss his latest book, I Am the People, Reflections on Popular Sovereignty Today. Bodhi will tell us a little bit more about the format of today's meeting.
Hi all, welcome to this. So the format is quite simple. So we are using the webinar format. So we will have a 20-minute presentation by Professor Chatterjee, followed by some Q&A with the rest of the panelists, rest of us. And then we will open it up to the floor, and you can send us all your questions via the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. And then we will raise them one by one. So that's pretty much it. So we're good to go. Yeah. Over to you, Professor Chatterjee.
Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss the book. The book has been out for a few months, but I think largely because of the pandemic and so on, where lots of other much more urgent questions came up. And so I haven't had a chance really to discuss the book with too many people. So this is indeed extremely opportune for me. And so thank you, Momita, Bodhi, Soraya, Sandre, and for organizing this. So what I'll do is, following the format, I'll just speak for a little bit about the main themes of the book, the sorts of main interventions that I was trying to make, and the connections between the different stages through which I take the argument in the book. So to begin with, I speak of that moment just after World War II in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when on the one side you have a relatively new intervention, mostly from anthropologists, which came to be known as cultural relativism, which basically made the argument that different cultures have different conceptions and standards of morality, and they should not be compared one to the other, and no universal standards of morality should be imposed on other cultures. And in fact, this led to a whole critique of even the very idea of civilization, because very often, as anthropologists were very keenly aware, lots of peoples whose cultures did not qualify as civilizations almost got left out of this entire discussion of morality, universal norms, and so on. So that was on the one side. But the point I was trying to make in that first chapter was that this moment after World War II was also a moment when, from among the former colonial countries of Asia and Africa in particular, there was a demand that each of these nations be recognized as an equal member of the global community of nations, and that they be given the universal right of self-determination, that is to say, national sovereignty. So, in a sense, this is the framing of that first chapter, which is, on the one side, you have notions of cultural relativism, but on the other side, precisely those cultures which presumably were being seen as the victims of a certain civilizational discourse all through the colonial period were now claiming that we have an equal right to the same universal moral standards that should prevail in the global sphere. So, and connected to this was the very question of the moral claims of the nation over its citizens. Now, this was, of course, very true in the case of particularly the European nations, through all the way through from the 19th century, and it was particularly true at the time of the Second World War, when, of course, as we know, the governments claimed and asked for enormous sacrifices from the people, citizens of their countries, and which they did get that moral claim of the nation. Now, the next stage of the argument comes with the founding of the so-called welfare states in most of Western Europe, Britain. And in post-war Europe, what you began now was, in a sense, I mean, and there's a whole progressive history which says this was the culmination of an entire stage of struggles through, all the way, you can go back to maybe even the French Revolution, where universal rights of citizenship were finally realized, not just in the sphere of political citizenship, but also economic citizenship, and then social citizenship. The economic and social rights of all citizens were recognized as universally valid, and this led to the founding of the welfare states, where all citizens, as a universal right, were guaranteed rights to livelihood, housing, health, education, and so on. Now, this now leads, and this is the interesting part where I think particularly, I would particularly value the interventions of a thinker like Michel Foucault, for instance, who makes the argument that this particular recognition of universal rights to a whole range of things connected with just the sheer living, carrying out one's life, leads to a whole set of techniques of surveillance, of classification, of optimization of needs and benefits. And this produces the entire apparatus of government, of modern government, that we are very familiar with through the 1950s and 60s. Now, what this leads to is the development of techniques of optimization of costs and benefits, of needs with benefits, and the rise of experts who would essentially make the determination of what is a proper allocation of scarce resources in order to fulfill these universal needs. Now, what it leads to then, and this we know, that from the 1970s onwards, you begin to get the critique of the welfare state. to which the criticism being that it is wasteful, that in fact people who can easily afford to pay don't pay, whereas because, let us say, the middle classes are better connected, they are better educated, they are much better able to avail of these services, whereas others who don't have those same social connections and means often get left out, even though they're entitled to various things. And so this leads to this criticism, which we know then leads to what is now broadly speaking called the neoliberal forms of governmental administration, which relies much more on less intervention by government and a reliance on market allocations. Now, this does not necessarily mean that government withdraws. In fact, what it means is an alternative, a different set of techniques of government or of administration, which also rely on surveillance, optimization, and all of those techniques, except the techniques are somewhat different. What it specifically tries to do is to identify specific groups of populations, identify their specific needs, and then, if necessary, fulfill their demands in a particular or specific way, differential way, right? Rather than as a set of universal rights available to everybody. So that is, broadly speaking, the sort of neoliberal turn. And we know that from the 1970s onwards, particularly in the US and Britain, but then in many other countries of Europe, of the West, this becomes a kind of dominant form of governmental administration of what earlier used to be called welfare. Now, my argument is that what we now call populism comes out of this particular kind of form of what you would call, following Foucault, biopolitical administration or biopolitical governance. Now, this means in specifically that there is, as we know, but well, let me put it this way: the response of populism actually follows two very different paths. One in the advanced capitalist countries of the West, and the other in, broadly speaking, what I'm calling post-colonial countries. There is populism in both of these cases, as we know, but we have to be careful to distinguish between these two kinds of populism because they have very different origins and very different consequences for society and politics. In the West, following from the neoliberal critique, what you have is what I'm calling a tactical withdrawal of the state from several specific areas of society, where earlier, for instance, in the heyday of the welfare state, the state or government would in fact intervene in a whole range of things. What happens with the neoliberal turn is a tactical withdrawal from many of these. So the state or the government seems to withdraw, and large numbers of things are left to the market. Not only left to the market, very often things are left to specific bodies of experts who are not subject to supervision by political authorities. So, for instance, things like, let us say, the function of the central bank. In many cases, for instance, even distribution of power, a whole range of other things which earlier was completely under government control, are now taken out of government control, largely because the argument is that if you subject them to government control, then electoral politics, political considerations would actually lead to very inefficient allocations. So leave it to the experts. So this happens. It also, what happens is that because there is a considerable weight given to expert opinion in each area, what happens is that there is an overall consensus or convergence of policy preferences across the political spectrum. So, for instance, even in the 1980s, 1990s, we saw there was very little to choose from between the two or three major political parties in any Western democracy. They, broadly speaking, they were all agreed upon certain basic policy preferences. What it led to, and this was also very widely noticed, was political apathy. That is to say, among voters, there was very little, because voters found very little to choose between different parties. So there was a large section of voters who simply didn't bother to go and vote. And so this was, broadly speaking, the situation which I would say prevailed in Western democracies well into the 1990s. Now, I think you could say there were signs that things were beginning to change, or there was beginning to be a reaction from even before. But I would say that the financial crisis of 2008-9 was, in a sense, the tipping point. Because following from that, through the early years of the new millennium, you began to see a whole range of popular mobilizations, movements, emergence of leaders who were not part of the older established party system. These were movements and leaders who, as it were, cropped up from outside the broad parties. And you have a whole range of movements and leaders of this kind across, from the United States to Britain to most of Europe. Movements and leaders of both, if you were to classify them in terms of their policies or their demands, they were both left-wing as well as right-wing, right? And you have a whole range of this. So this is, broadly speaking, the emergence of populism. And then, of course, you could make specific arguments about specific leaders, for instance, people like Trump or Orban or maybe Erdogan and so on. Now, so this is broadly speaking what I think is the story of populism in the West. In the post-colonial countries, and I meant India, because in post-colonial countries, especially where there are established systems of electoral democracy, I think populism is something that emerged from a long time ago, from at least the 1970s. Because these were forms of government, which I made the argument, where, in a sense, the rule of capital is actually the hegemony of capital is actually restricted to a very small section of society, which you, broadly speaking, might call the urban middle classes. Outside this, capital does not have the kind of moral hegemony, right, which it could claim in the West. Rather, it has to rule through what, broadly speaking, in Gramscian terms, he would call dominance. And this dominance is secured through political parties and political leaders who manage to cobble together majorities, electoral majorities, right? And this process of forming electoral majorities in a population which is very, very heterogeneous, right? A very important method by which these electoral majorities were put together was what we would call populism today. That is to say, as Laclau would argue, you establish chains of equivalence between very different kinds of demands, but rhetorically you're able to suggest that all of these demands are not being met because they are being resisted by some enemy of the people who are in power, right? This could be a ruling party, a particular group, an ethnic group. You can identify it in all kinds of ways. But that's the ruling group in power, and they are the ones who are resisting, and we are all equally exploited. And that's the basic rhetorical form by which these electoral majorities are constructed. Now, uh, what I've argued is that you could see this form emerging in electoral democracies like India from the 1970s. And I think I give a particular example of Tamil Nadu in India, where you could actually see what I would call competitive populism, which is to say it's one populist party is challenged by another populist party. And the logic or the reason by which they put together or try to put together majorities is exactly the same. So there is competitive populism on two sides. And I think this is, broadly speaking, the characteristic now that's emerged all over India. So populism is not new in post-colonial situations. Specifically in the case of India, and I make this argument in the very last chapter, what is new is the move, particularly in the last year or so, say following the 2019 elections in particular, the move to actually transition from what is, broadly speaking, a populist majority into an attempt to construct a hegemonic form of the nation, which will have moral power over citizens, and do this by excluding a significant portion of the population, permanently excluding a significant part of the population. Now, this is very new because what it is attempting to do is, in fact, redefine the nation. It is not simply constructing a new kind of genuine true people versus an enemy. It is actually trying to use that earlier form to make a permanent transformation in the nature of the republic itself, which will permanently eliminate and reduce a part of the people into the status of a subordinate population without rights, essentially without rights. So that is the attempt that I think is being made, which in terms of the way I've argued this, is not simply populism. It's something more, something different. So so that's the overall argument. I also make in that afterward, because this is particularly in Europe, I know this is a very important topic of discussion. Is there a difference between left and right populism? And does left populism have a certain kind of transformative potential, right? Right populism, of course, the argument is this is very destructive and so on and so forth. But left populism, does it have a transformative potential? And my considered opinion is that no, it doesn't. Left populism can only make certain very limited sorts of interventions, because fundamentally the form of populist intervention is crucially dependent upon the, you might basically say, revenues generated from a growing capitalist sector. It's by taxing or drawing revenues from a flourishing, growing capitalist economy that the entire project of left populism, which could include all kinds of progressive policies which will benefit ordinary people, that's without any question. But does it transform? And that is my crucial question. It seems to me that it doesn't. And we've seen several instances where this kind of left populist agenda is actually subverted very easily, simply because it is so totally dependent upon support from a growing and, of course, globally connected capital. So if you think of Syriza in Greece, Podemos has never been completely in power very much for very long. So these are that's basically the overall argument of the book. So I'll stop here and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for that, Partha. Yeah, so it's now really for the four panelists. So Maybe, yeah. Soraya, would you like to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Partha. Thank you so much for inaugurating this particular series. We're so grateful, and I'm so grateful. And it's lovely to see you after such a long time.
You too.
Yeah, and I'm relieved and happy to hear that you are safe and well in Calcutta. So the question I sent you, perhaps I should repeat it for those who were not able to read it. I mean, if you don't mind my reading it.
No,
to you.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Please do.
I was piggybacking off of my colleagues' questions, but it had more to do with there's another question that comes up, but I'll bring that up later, with regard to the Philippines and Duterte, but I'll put that aside. But for now, I'm focusing on your description of, I had a problem with your description of Trump and Brexit, in large part because I was thinking that when I was focusing on your discussion of how can the kind of British Republic or British public come to, saying no, right, to being part of the European Union, I thought, Partha, you have to be more cynical, and more. You have to think about the actual sinister relationship that is taking place outside of this kind of entrenched elite that exists. And so here was my question. I said, do you think in some part that the cynicism, quote unquote, that you might convey in this work about present day populism and its upsurge maybe doesn't go far enough, that it goes beyond the sustaining of a passive revolution at work, meaning that present day populist politics out of the West are made possible through more evil, sinister means than we think, given that recent versions were enabled through data harvesting, mining, funded by billionaires who are not held accountable to any law, political system, morality, political process. They view themselves as outside of any of these systems, even separate from the entrenched elite, meaning like the Davos crew. I couldn't help but think about your discussion of Brexit and Trump and wonder, neither would have been made possible without the dubious illegal tactics of Cambridge Analytica, Robert Mercer, the billionaire from the United States, and Russian assistance a la Putin. So, but they aren't necessarily organized or self-conscious, but they truly have enormous resources and work outside the typical structures of decision-making in advanced capitalist countries. So can any discussion of the people, at least as you describe it in the West, exclude their sinister impact, their role, and how they maneuver to control how people view or receive information about leaders and government? So if you could respond to that as well. And then there's also another question which I would love to ask, but it's up to Bodhi Momita if I can ask it now or later. So I'll hold off. I'll let everyone, everyone will take his or her turn, and then I'll ask you about the Philippines. But if you could respond, that would be great.
Thank you. So you're quite right. There are many of these instances that we know of. And of course, there must be many others that we don't know anything about, of these sinister plots, behind the scenes attempts to try and control, manipulate and control popular outcomes of various movements in order to steer it in a particular direction so that certain groups of companies or business interests and so on can profit from it. Now, one of the arguments I did make in the book is that populism or populist strategies are often supported by owners of capital. Now, however, it is a risky strategy. My argument would be this is not the kind of organic support that, for instance, earlier was established between business groups and, let's say, large parties, whether the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, or all the major, center-right or center-left parties in Europe. We all know of the ways in which they were, in a sense, represented the interests of capital. But this is different in the sense that it's a risky strategy, because after all, the populist leader or a populist movement is not necessarily organically connected with a structure of relationships, right? In the way in which the older party system, for instance, was. And it's risky because we are already seeing with Trump, there are so many kinds of decisions that he takes, which are not necessarily in agreement with the interests of, for instance, the whole relationship with China and the trade relations in the, is not necessarily something that's supported by most business groups, who would much prefer a continuation of the older forms of, globalized trade and commerce and financial transactions and so on. So these are, but as always in such situations, conscious and organized class interests often do take risks, given a critical situation in certain respects. So if you were to make the argument that, let us say, the impasse between opposed political groups had led to a situation, and especially we're thinking of the situation following the 2008 financial crisis, where economic options, in a sense, had reduced a great deal. So, if in a situation like this, if in fact it became clear that because of a certain populist upsurge, some leader was likely to emerge very powerful, then does a business group take the risk of backing that leader in the hope that we'll be able to control him? And maybe if it turns completely against our interests, then we'll even topple him. So all of that is possible. So this is leading to precisely this zone of uncertainty, where on the one side you have structural relations, but these kinds of political decisions, which are specific events, specific options that are chosen politically in the political battlefield, as it were, there's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence always, right? And that is precisely the kind of zone of uncertainty where I think the question you're raising is an important question. But I am not sure that one can make a sort of generally or generalizable proposition here based on examples of this kind.
Thank you for that. So I'll hold off on the other question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Partha, to accommodate a few more questions, especially from the attendees, I was wondering if you would like to pick one of the questions that we have sent you, if there's one that you found interesting and would like to answer.
Oh, lots of them were interesting. Bodhi, why don't you choose one? Which one would you like me to answer?
Bodhi's going to choose his own question. Okay.
No, or you too. I mean, just
okay.
And I suppose you probably need to specify the question itself for the others who may not know.
So should I?
Momita,
these are long questions as well.
Momita, you should go ahead.
Okay. So I say that maybe we just repeat one question each from the several that we had, and maybe Sindri can begin with the question.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Professor Chatterjee, thank you very much for this opportunity to engage with your work and your latest monograph in particular. I'm very honored to be part of this initiative and also to be part of this wonderful collective. Now, it seems to me that Partha is a bit too modest to do this himself, so I thought I could just show the book, right? This is the book we are discussing, namely I'm the People, Reflections on Popular Sovereignty Today, published by Columbia University Press earlier this year, and I believe first presented as the prestigious Franz Boas Memorial Lectures at Columbia University in New York.
Actually the Ruth Benedict lectures.
Oh, sorry, the Ruth Benedict lectures, right? 2018. Sorry about that. Now, I'm just going to simply pick out one of my questions, right? It seems to me that we need to talk about Gramsci in the context of your work. Here too, obviously, because he is certainly a guiding point throughout much of your work. Now, drawing on Gramsci, you argue for a fundamental distinction between A, the integral state, and B, the extended state. In this scheme of things, the welfare states of post-World War II Europe represents the most advanced iteration of the integral state, whereas the post-colonial Indian state serves as the primary examples of the example of the extended state. Now, in the context of your assertion to the effect that the most meaningful way to understand populism is as a crisis of bourgeois hegemony, this comes on page 84, I read you as saying that this crisis of bourgeois hegemony is equally applicable to societies with an integral state and societies with an extended state, and that the construction of the people, consequently, as a Saussurean floating signifier on the part of populist parties is an attempt to paper over the fractures generated by this very crisis of bourgeois hegemony. But obviously, you know, as an anthropologist, and what I appreciate in your outstanding work, if I may say so, is precisely the impulse to address a very large canvas, right? But it also leaves the question what is the difference in your view between creating and sustaining the construction of this people as a floating signifier in the European and the Indian context? If you can elaborate on that, because these are highly divergent tasks, of course.
Right. Thank you. I mean, in a sense, you've asked this question, which relates to almost you know, one of the central arguments that I am making. So, if I were to answer the question this way by reformulating my argument in these terms, that if you were to look at the techniques of populism, the specific rhetorical form by which this floating signifier called the people is filled, then you will find many similarities between populism in Western countries today and populism in many of the post-colonial countries. So whether it's in India, or let's say Duterte in Philippines, or many of these other kinds of places. And certainly if you go to Latin America, I haven't considered Latin America very carefully, because there is in fact a large literature on populism in South America, especially in relation to Peronism in Argentina. But if you were to simply look at the commonalities in terms of the populist techniques, there are many commonalities. But if you were to look at the earlier part of my argument, which is what is it a response, what kind of crisis is it a response to, then the crisis is very different in nature in the Western capitalist countries and in the post-colonial countries. Because in a sense, the crisis in the West, as I explained, is a crisis of bourgeois hegemony, that the forms in which this hegemony was earlier constructed, I would say ever since the end of the Second World War, from the 1950s onwards, that which rested very much upon the rule of capital on the one side and as a very organized set of interests, and the political organization of electoral democracies through a party system, mass trade unions, large political parties, that connection, that was really sustained this bourgeois hegemony or capitalist hegemony in the West, all the way through, as I said, into the early years of the 2000s. This led to the crisis came. Of course, there was the financial crisis, which caused this. And then what happened subsequently? This is the crisis which had to be met politically. And for the moment, populism has emerged as a form. Now, I don't think populism is an answer, even for, and this is my answer to Soraya's question also, I don't think this is a satisfactory resolution of the crisis as far as the owners of capital are concerned. They don't think that Donald Trump is necessarily rescuing rescuing the entire economy and the political dominance of capital, right? This is only a very temporary and, as I keep saying, a very risky option that they've chosen. But that is the situation in the West. As far as post-colonial countries in the East, or broadly speaking, Asia and maybe many African countries, I think the same argument could be made, especially where there are established political systems of competitive party elections, electoral systems. In these places, populism, as I said, as a technique is a very well established. So the crisis is of a different kind. The crisis here in many countries emerges in the way in which populist systems could sustain, because you're so very dependent upon these populist social expenditures in order to benefit and satisfy their support bases. That is how the system operates. But it depends entirely upon a period of a constantly growing economy. Once there is an economic crisis for whatever reasons, and for these countries, many of these reasons need not even be internal to these economies. They could be external shocks, depending upon crisis in the global economy. Some of these countries are dependent upon one or two crucial exports, or which particularly this is true with the oil-rich countries, for instance. Or there are many others where certain agricultural products or certain kinds of minerals are the main it sustains the entire economy. And of course, those can be subject to all sorts of crises because of global movements of prices and so on. And any of these crises could lead to a total crisis of a particular populist regime. So we see this, for instance, Venezuela is a good example of this. So this kind of crisis is a much more endemic crisis. This is not particularly new. This crisis of a populist regime or a populist system, entirely new populist parties emerging. We've seen this in India many, many times. Completely out of the blue, you get a leader and a new movement which produces a party which stays in power for a while and then very often declines. So this is a much more endemic form. And as I said, the crisis is because in these countries, you don't have that deep social hegemony of the capitalist sector, because that is necessarily restricted to a fairly small zone of economic production. Large parts are outside of the control of organized corporate capital.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Partha. We have several very good questions from our attendees, and I thought I'll ask a couple. Zaad Mahmood asks, could you kindly elucidate more on the argument of the declining moral claim of the nation, especially with the upsurge of nationalism in South Asia? And could we take another question?
Yeah.
This is from Topati, actually, Professor Topati Bhuttakuta. She asks, since populism revolves around the quote-unquote cult of the leader, what happens to populism, right or left wing, in the absence of cultic, charismatic leaders? Consider the cases of DMK, AIDMK, or TDP in South India at present in the absence of the mega leaders.
Thank you. Moral claim of the nation. Now, again, I would say one would have to make the distinction between the moral claim, which I would argue has significantly declined in the Western countries, certainly over the last 3 or 4 decades. Think of a very, very simple question, which if you were to compare with the situation, let us say, in the earlier part of the 20th century. Today, for instance, in no country in the West would you have a situation where a government could call upon the citizens of the country to, let us say, volunteer for the army in order to go and fight a war somewhere. You've seen this particularly in the United States, where, certainly from the time of the Vietnam War onwards, you have increasingly a situation where, and this has completely changed the nature of warfare, the techniques of warfare, where the idea of troops going somewhere with the risk of being killed is deeply to be avoided. It's shunned. So the idea that you had in the early part of the 20th century, where citizens could be called upon to sacrifice for something like a national interest, is something that is politically no longer seen to be a valid call to make. It has led to a whole range of other, as I said, the forms of politics, the kinds of interventions that governments make, all of this has changed because of this. So that's the declining moral claim on the nation. Does that operate equally in, let us say, post-colonial countries? Probably not. And here we can have a lot of other arguments to make, because in many of these cases, first of all, for many of these cases, warfare is much more common. Warfare, particularly at home, is much more common. I mean, Western Europe or the United States has not had a war at home since World War II. Whereas, think of countries like Iran, a lot of the countries in the Middle East, there is a considerable appeal even now of the claim of the nation on citizens. And of course, as we know, this is played upon very, very effectively by populist leaders who often use this sentiment of patriotism and so on in order to shore up their own regimes, right? So again, I would say there is a distinction to be drawn between this moral claim of the nation in the way it's declined. My argument is it's certainly declined in the West, but the situation may be very different, particularly in specific countries in Asia or Africa. And of course, in many of these countries, the very idea of a single nation may well be a contested idea, because there are often very deep divisions in many post-colonial countries, so that you could very well have a claim, a national claim, being rejected by some part of the population. That's also equally possible. So, that's a very different area then. But I would say that in principle, the moral claims are still theirs. And that's partly the argument I was making in the first chapter. Now, top of this question about what happens to populist parties when the recognized leader is no longer there. And yes, this is a very interesting and important argument. There are not, I wouldn't say many, but there are several examples of parties in India which has made this transition from one leader to another. So if you think of the DMK earlier on, from Annadurai to Karunanidhi was a transition. They made the transition. ADMK, from MGR to Jayalalitha, the transition was made. But there are equally, maybe a greater number of examples where the transition failed. It didn't happen. It did not work. And it's not necessarily only the family connection. There are very interesting arguments to be made where the family connection did not necessarily work. But, for instance, would you say that the transition from N.T. Ramarao to Chandrababu Naidu actually worked. Maybe it worked for a while. It didn't last because Chandrababu Naidu actually didn't follow the classic patterns of a populist leader. So there are interesting things to be made, or two arguments to be made there. And of course, we know there are several examples of parties where once the original founding leader was gone, the movement or the party collapsed. So all of those options are possible. Yes.
Bodhi, do you want to go now?
Yeah, sure. I had a question which is somewhat in those question banks, but also something else. It was this is absolutely fascinating to me, and also because I kind of look at the contemporary moment from the perspective of science fiction and imaginaries of the future, and you tie this to the global financial crisis and contemporary rise in populist movements around the world. So that's absolutely fascinating to me, because a lot of these new science fiction movements, indigenous futurisms, for instance, or Latinx futurisms, these are also coming up during this period where people are claiming a certain kind of popular sovereignty, if one wants to call it that, based on different kinds of affiliations and so on. So I was wondering if you could give us some of your thoughts on what you see the future of these movements, because I kind of sense in many of these there's the notion of a leaderless movement in the sense of almost of anarchism. So I'm just curious to know your thoughts. Thanks.
Now, of course, these are, as you said, these are particularly, the ones that the examples that you give. There's a lot that is new about this kind of, if you were to call them populist movements. They are new. You see, it's not necessarily that there haven't been populist movements which have been leaderless, but the interesting question is, what do you see, or what do these movements see as their objective, or as the goal that they wish to achieve? So if they're indeed sort of anarchist, and many of them probably have strong anarchist kinds of ideas that drive them, then in a sense they are not interested in setting up their own regime or their own power structure. They're not trying to replace one oppressive power structure with another power structure which could in principle be also oppressive, right? So in a sense then, what they're maybe looking for, or they would probably claim they're looking for, is a transformation which is quite radical and fundamental, and possibly move towards, even if not transform the whole society, but in a sense set up examples, right? Exemplary events or moments or structures which could show the way to a kind of organization of society where you do not need a state. You don't need a state apparatus. You don't need leaders, for instance. So I think they clearly do have enormous potential in this sense. Do they actually pose a challenge to existing structures? And this is where I would say I am extremely skeptical, because once again, the staying power of existing structures, it seems to me, is so robust, at least for the moment, that it's very difficult to see this kind of leaderless, anarchist-inspired movements actually shaking this to its foundations, right? I don't see serious possibilities of this happening. So that's my initial response to your question. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So this is a conversation that some of us have been having for a while, and it's sort of a question that comes from theory from the margins, which is this idea that you posit of, or Ruth Benedict's conception of national character versus Radha Vinod Pal's idea of the equal sovereign body, how this goes together, you know, this conflict. We were wondering, where do you think the role of cultural relativism is now, today, in contemporary anthropology and area studies disciplines? We're thinking about how these debates, you know, the critique of homo equalis in anthropology, in area studies disciplines, the critique of it also questions any activist, let's say, who's driven by a kind of moral urgency to work on the field, for example. So for example, the question is then, how does cultural relativism play out today? Your thoughts on that? And where would you say that us as knowledge producers, like Ruth Benedict you show, worked for the security department? Or we know from Timothy Mitchell's work how the area studies department were set up and so on. Where do you see us as producers of theory and the relationships with neoliberal governmentality?
See, those are two, well, I don't know, possibly there might be a connection between those two questions, but for the moment, let's treat them separately. So in terms of cultural relativism, obviously this is something that's quite deeply rooted in the methods of anthropology as a discipline, or you might even say, you know, the later versions like cultural studies and disciplines like that, which basically takes a non-judgmental view of the values of a culture. So the argument is that because that clearly is reminiscent of a much older, you know, the older kind of anthropology or the older kind of civilizational studies, which studies a so-called alien culture. Yes, it tries to describe the internal dynamics and workings and the internal norms and values of that culture, but always assuming that, you know, we are studying some really strange group of people, and obviously it does not affect our own notions of morality and value and so on. So that's the older form, and of course we know it was really as a critique of the old colonial anthropology that the methods of cultural relativism and so on came in. You might even say that that has an important bearing on notions such as pluralism, multiculturalism, and so on, which were important ideas even within Western liberal society. And it affected the ways in which, let's say, even in Western society, one was conditioned or socialized, you might say, to look at other apparently strange people, but not make the judgment that, you know, earlier one might have done. So that's the position there. The difficulty once again is that very often this could equally lead to a hierarchization. Even if you say that these people are different, let's not judge them, right? There could well be implicitly a hierarchization between different cultures, and whether or not this necessarily, so for instance, things like a whole range of, you know, you've seen this very interestingly in feminist debates, for instance, you know, about Western feminists and their attempts to try and so-called liberate, you know, Black women from Black men, or and so on. I mean, that's led to a whole range of debates and criticism, because in a sense, the argument once again is that there is, you could very well say that we are not being judgmental, and yet we are. So this is the interesting problem, which I think one cannot get away from. So the question once again becomes the difference between, if you were to say cultural relativism, then you have to concede a certain autonomy to this other society or this other culture, and you must accept whatever form of internal decision making and internal resolution of conflicts these societies might have. Now, that does not necessarily always result in an acceptable, globally recognizable norm, because then, of course, you would say, oh, there is patriarchy there, there is incredible violence there, and so on. I mean, and you're essentially then saying that nobody else has any business trying to, say anything about these other places. So this is the balance. I think, this debate or conflict has not been resolved. It's very much there. And the question very often is, how does one negotiate in specific situations? How does one negotiate between these contending arguments, right? So, for instance, questions of self-determination very often lead to situations where people would say, well, how can you concede, self-determination to a society where there is so much internal, division and oppression that only a small, tiny group is going to use this right of sovereignty in order to oppress their own people. So does nobody intervene in a situation like that? And so that becomes the crucial problem, right? So I think one of the important things, particularly in relation to the sovereignty question, the crucial argument that was often made, and probably still has to be made, although we all know that the United Nations, or certainly the structure of the Security Council, is not made that way. But this was the form of the General Assembly, where, as we know, each member has only one vote. And that is, of course, the classical liberal constitutional form. That if the United Nations, or if there was to be a global intervention in some particular case, then it should be the majority of countries which should agree on this. But that is not how it works. How it works is that a few countries, of course, these were 5 countries initially who chosen at the time, who have a right of veto. And without it, the global body cannot work in security situations. So this, that's again a compromise between 2 very different conceptions, which, as I said, both have strong arguments on their behalf. And the question is, how does one negotiate between these 2 contending views?
Unfortunately, I think we are out of time today. So I would just like to thank everybody, our panel. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Partha, for doing this for us. It was incredible honor to have you as our first speaker in this series.
Thank you very much. It was very enjoyable, extremely perceptive and acute questions. And I enjoyed, going back to this book. I haven't opened this in quite some time, a few months now. So I had a chance to rethink some of these things that I wrote in the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. We have some questions that we weren't able to attend to. I can actually send an email to Partha with those questions, and
sure.
We can, yes. Thank you very much. And please follow the space for more talks. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Momita.